The story of Star Wars Galaxies is one of irresistible fantasy. The fantasy of life in the Star Wars universe, the fantasy of becoming a Jedi, and for legendary game designer Raph Koster, the fantasy of a dream game project, a Star Wars MMORPG. But with irresistible fantasy comes unavoidable risk. And so the story of Star Wars Galaxies is a story of problems. The story of a wildly ambitious sandbox MMO made against staggering odds and impossible expectations. A game whose capacity to fulfill the dreams of countless Star Wars fans led to one of the most fascinating game design problems in games history, the Jedi Problem.
So Sony Online Entertainment had cut a deal with LucasArts and Lucasfilm to make an MMO based on Star Wars on the strength of what they'd accomplished with EverQuest. And at the time they had an EverQuest 2 in development and several other MMOs. It was a moment when SOE was going from a one-title shop to a many-title kind of studio. During that time, actually, myself and what became the core of the Galaxies team, we were actually working at Origin. But the project we were on was canceled, and we all quit, and we ended up getting a studio opened for us by Sony Online. They hired us and set up a studio in Austin. They asked us to come in and take a look at the progress that their Star Wars Online was making. We were then slightly shocked, because on that very same trip, we met with everybody, and then we told management where we thought the game was, and the meeting ended with them saying, "Why don't you take it over?" Which we absolutely had not expected. We thought that the game was well in progress and that team owned it and so on. It was shocking. We spent the entire flight back going, this will be a death march of crunch. This will be excruciatingly hard. Yeah, but it's Star Wars. They've been going for a year and we're going to have to restart it, and the tech base isn't going to work. We're going to have to change it. Yeah, but it's Star Wars. Yeah, but we're going to be held to this budget. Yeah, but it's Star Wars. and we just kept doing that the whole flight back. And then when we got back and met with the team, we basically laid out all of this giant list of cons. And yeah, but it's Star Wars won out. So we ended up deciding to try to take it on. Part of the reason was that what the team had been working on at Origin had also been a science fiction MMO with spaceflight. We had been working on an MMO called Privateer Online, which was essentially a spin-off of the Wing Commander series, which back then was one of maybe the most popular space sim out there on the market. That's how we got involved on it. It was politically a nightmare because, the existing team felt like their baby was being yanked away, which it was. I think all the engineers in San Diego on the team quit over it. We ended up working with artists in San Diego, but the center of gravity for design moved to Austin. And it was just perpetually a drag on the project because now we had split development in multiple locations when our team had just barely really started to gel. We were rebooting everything but already had a sizable team. Yeah, it was just awkward, and it led to a lot of bad blood between Austin and San Diego offices. It was very challenging sort of in terms of company politics.
Despite the obvious challenges that lay ahead, the prospect of making a sandbox MMO set in the Star Wars universe was understandably irresistible. But the power of a fantasy that comes with a world as beloved and established as Star Wars and the Jedi comes with its own set of difficulties. Raph and the team's bold set of solutions to these problems is, to my mind, one of the most interesting pieces of game design history, but the tension between the ambitious dreams of game designers and both the calculating desires of their publisher and the grim realities of making a game under tight time constraints led to the Jedi Problem ultimately being one of the major reasons for this game's downfall.
Jedi are what in MMOs today we call that an alpha class, which basically means if you choose to go on this track, you will be more powerful than all the other players. Which, Games are supposed to be fair, so that gets in the way. But it's such a powerful fantasy to be a Jedi. I saw the original movie 13 times in the theater, right? When I was 8, 7, something like that. So, we all played at Jedi with our Kenner action figures and all the rest. It's too powerful a fantasy not to serve it in some way. We knew from the MMO background that this was a massive problem. Unfortunately, one of the key things that had already been negotiated was the time period in which the game would be set. That had been pinned down in the prior negotiations. That was a challenge because in this time period, we were set in between A New Hope and Empire Strikes Back, which means that at this moment, the entire galaxy is turning itself upside down to hunt down just one Jedi. There was an expanded universe of novels that suggested that there were more laying around, hiding in various places and so on. But the point was, Jedi were rare, but they were incredibly powerful, and everybody would want to be one. My first idea was, can we change the time period? Because if we just slide forward to after Lucas set up his school or whatever, we can have loads of Jedi. and the answer to that was no. It was a contractual obligation to set it there. And that left us with the dilemma. It's something everybody wants. It's meant to be uber powerful. There aren't supposed to be any. The first suggestion that we landed at was the core idea that you shouldn't know how to become a Jedi. We had this notion that it should be very, very hard to figure even out how to become a Jedi. And it shouldn't be reproducible, because if it's reproducible, then everybody will just go reproduce it. We wanted it to be fair, but we didn't want it to just be a die roll. Oh, you got lucky, you got a golden ticket. Other people know they don't get a golden ticket and they're condemned to never be a Jedi. Also didn't feel fair to us, because it's kind of a promise on the box, right? Like, people have an expectation. So we knew that we needed a system whereby people could become Jedi through their actions, but we didn't want them to know exactly how. And then the second question was, what do we do about their power? We were trying to stay true to the setting and the lore, and in this time period, if you just let people pick it from the beginning, not only will they be everywhere, but if they are more powerful, everyone will pick them. And this is something that, again, the expanded universe lore and even the movies have wrestled with. They've had to gradually up the power of other things in the setting. But none of those were really around in the setting that we were limited to. So that was a bit of a problem. That meant we went, well, we can't just let them be a choice at the beginning. We have to make it obscure. If we make them super powerful, though, and we don't have any other way for these other roles to compete, then that means we have to find a way to knock them down a peg. And you basically have two choices there. One is to not make them super powerful. Make Jedi be on par with Han Solo, which is not really fair or accurate to the movies, right? It just wasn't really how they're portrayed. The other choice is to make it so that, yes, they can be super powerful. There's some other kind of trade-off. And the trade-off that I personally favored was a very gamey solution. We'd already seen in games, call it Iron Man mode. We were seeing that in Diablo had a permadeath-enabled mode that you could choose to play the game, where if you died once, that was it. You were done. Many MUDs had been run that way, where if you died once with your character, it was over. That character was dead and you had to re-roll. That was a very common thing. D&D works that way, right? Like, it wasn't an unusual thing, but it was not the norm for MMOs, because death was fairly common in MMOs, and in fact in most MUDs. The core of the idea was you unlock Jedi, and what it does is unlock an Iron Man mode that is a separate character slot where you now play with a Jedi. But if the Jedi dies, they're dead. And to push back even further against it, we would make it increasingly harder the more powerful you got. We would start sending bounty hunters after you, then, Mara Jade, and eventually Darth Vader after you. And once Darth Vader came for you, you were just going to die. It was like you had to play the game of trying to stay hidden and not attract the attention of the Empire. So it was sort of an incentive to how long can I keep my guy alive? Which means not using Jedi powers too profligately, right? Not using them openly and widely, because it would push up your visibility meter. Think of it almost like a stealth game, right? Like you're trying to stay stealthy. That was the core idea, but permadeath was actually quite unpopular, right? People really didn't want permadeath. They're like, what happens if I get a little bit of internet lag? Which was much worse of a problem back then than it is today. You know, think how people complain about lag now. It was so much worse back then. Lag was an everyday factor, right? So we kept trying to design things like, it's okay if you die, you keep your Jedi slot, but you get a blue glowy. So then you can conjure them up, even on your other character, your main one, you can conjure up an assortment of them, like at the end of Return of the Jedi. For all of the Jedi you've gotten up to a certain point, and it's sort of like bragging rights. Check me out, I've done it 8 times, there's my runs. In the end, there was just too much pushback from team and public on it, and it was a bit too weird an idea, and so it got shut down in favor of just the hidden pathway part. But it would be your main character, just unlocked Jedi skills from that point forward. What we landed on was essentially a personality test, kind of. That was the original design. We would make a list of hundreds of activities within the game, ranging from everything like dancing a jig to climbing the top of a tall mountain to crafting a sandwich to, just a spread of activities that intentionally covered a bunch of different profiles. If you were somebody who only did combat, you probably wouldn't hit all of these activities. Only extremely well-rounded players would hit all of the different categories. So we created these multiple categories, and then we gave every individual their own randomized little list that was balanced across the categories. That was the design. So it would be a well-rounded individual, but they would not know what their checklist was. It was invisible. And in fact, many on the team would not even know what the path was, so that it wouldn't leak. It was made worse by the fact that when we got close to the end of development and were trying to implement the system, we found that we didn't have the time and the database capability to track all of those different actions, because it required setting up hundreds of little hooks, right, to detect each of the actions. And we are incredibly crunched for time. The team is a year from finishing and 2 months from launching. And, that whole game was built in less than 3 years. I think it was like 2 years and 3/4 or something like that. Maybe 2 years and a quarter. It was a very short amount of time. And it was a very long day. And I remember the producer and the lead server programmer came to me and said, we just can't do what we designed on paper. But we have an alternative. We have something that we are already tracking that hits across all the different playstyles. It is the skills that people choose to learn. Because our progression system allowed people to dabble in everything. And so you could be a dabbler who tried things across all the categories, or you could specialize in just one thing. And they said, that's a reasonable proxy. You won't be required to craft a sandwich, but you could be required to have learned how to be a chef. You won't be required to go exploring, but we could, climb a specific mountain, but we could tie it to you learned a particular skill in the scout ranger sort of vein. It was towards the end of a long day. I was exhausted. They were exhausted. We were all working 12 to 14-hour days, including weekends, for 9 continuous months at that point, and I signed off on it. And it was a monumental mistake, because unlike the other method where dance a jig was an emote, right? It was a social animation, and climbing a mountain was a physical activity, and killing a particular monster was a particular combat activity, and so on, making it individual skill unlocks. They were all the same, right? In the sense that they were all just skill unlocks. The original system subdivided the actions into 4 big categories, and this method didn't subdivide it into categories. It was just an arbitrary list of which skills to go learn. It wasn't divided for variety, so to speak. There were only 700-ish skills anyway, so it was a far smaller set of activities too. So it meant that it was very easy to reverse engineer what it was from a very small amount of hints. So then came the coup de grace, which was the system is in, and we start getting asked by marketing, when will we see the first Jedi, because we want to goose sales by Christmas. And we started looking, and players in the game were playing the way they liked. They went and learned the skills that fit their particular play style, and they would go off and they'd play that way. Very few players were of the inclination to go try everything and learn everything, right? Because that's just not how people are, right? Like, I have a musical hobby, but that means I don't rebuild car engines, right? I like what I like, and I specialize in what I like. I might have diverse likes, but, it's unusual for a person to be chasing everything, right? And so we ran the numbers and found that at the rate that we were going, the first person to unlock Jedi might take a decade to do it. And marketing said, well, then you need to drop hints.
And so came the infamous mandate from LucasArts marketing: we need a Jedi by Christmas. A one-sentence encapsulation of the tension between ambitious and frictional game design and the cold, calculating perspective of those funding the game. And as much as my sympathies automatically align with the game designers in this situation, it's not difficult for me to emulate the mindset of the money people in this scenario. Funding a Star Wars game in which people could become Jedi, but in which not a single person had actually done so. The beauty of such an unattainable experience in a game like this is a thing that is difficult to communicate to those who are not themselves passionate about game design.
At this point, I was already mostly off the team. At the point that Galaxies had shipped, I had been offered a promotion to be an executive there at Sony Online. And as part of that, I was paying much more attention to other things. There was a deal to make a Harry Potter Online that was brewing. There were, all kinds of other things. And I was assigned to go work on these other things and not just on Galaxies. I was supposed to hand it over. The decision was made to drop hints as part of an event. You could find in-game objects that told you, hey, you need to go learn this skill. That's one of the items in your checklist. Well, within a couple of hours of that feature launching, people were comparing notes online, and they all saw, all of my hints are skills. How about yours? Yeah, mine too. And people said, well, if that's the case, then the algorithm to become a Jedi is learn every skill in order, and you're guaranteed to get there. And so people did that. And mostly hated it, right? Because that would be like taking my guitars away and telling me, no, you must go to car shop now. And you're not allowed to play guitar because we had a cap on how many things you could learn and master in the game at once. You have to give up your real hobbies and go do these things you don't like. And so all the players who enjoyed raising pets suddenly found themselves having to kill them and cook them. And all the players who enjoyed cooking and hanging out and playing cozy gameplay in a nice safe space found themselves having to run out and fight giant monsters. And all the people who enjoyed fighting giant monsters found themselves condemned to go dance in a cantina. And all the people who enjoyed role-playing and chatting and dancing in a cantina found themselves required, and you get the idea. And everybody did it anyway. The lure of being a Jedi was so powerful that everybody wanted it. But the quality of your day-to-day experience plummeted. And as a result, we started to see that the audience that had been growing stopped growing. And it wasn't because of less people joining the game. It was because they were lasting less time. Because they were being told by the game systems to play the game in ways they didn't like.
Intuitively, you would assume if there are these other options that require you to do things that you wouldn't enjoy, that people would be like, all right, well, I'll just not do that. But what do you think pulls people away from playstyles that they enjoy towards that power fantasy?
One of the big things that I think running virtual worlds teaches you are the ways in which people are not rational. It teaches you a whole bunch of things about group dynamics, and it has a way of kind of upending your political beliefs, because you find yourself kind of governing a population the size of a small city, and you have to get pragmatic really, really quickly about what retains people, why do they stick around, and so on, right? And one of the big lessons about it is, for better or for worse, people do the things they are incentivized to do, even if they don't like it. And we know this from game shows, which offer you $5,000 to eat a bowl of squirming grubs. People will do it. They will bathe in tarantulas if you offer them an incentive. And so it's not surprising that if you dangle, hey, would you like to be an all-powerful space wizard with a glowy sword? Or do you want to keep cooking, dancing, or fighting monsters by hand? You know, which do they go with? Especially when it's a childhood fantasy they all grew up with. They choose the childhood fantasy, right? It's too powerful an incentive. We see this even in subtler ways. We actually gathered data. We ran tests on ourselves as players to see how much time we spent doing different things in the game, right? As we were debating the design of Star Wars Galaxies. Because we wanted to see, well, how much time do you actually spend chatting? Therefore, how much time should we spend on the chat system? Everybody's estimates were way, way, way off. Like the most hardcore combat go person was like, oh, I do 90% of my time is spent adventuring. I very rarely stop to just shoot the shit with friends. Turned out it was 50% of the time he was chatting with friends. And he was shocked by this result, just utterly shocked. Because time flew when he was chatting. He didn't realize how much time he was spending doing it.
I kind of think that your original vision for the Jedi design in Star Wars Galaxies was kind of like an illusory infinite end game. It was like a carrot on an impossibly long stick, where because people didn't know the path towards it, it was sort of this omnipresent possibility that imbued the rest of the game with a sort of specialness. The idea that people could become Jedi in the world made it feel all the more special, not because that's what we were driving towards, but because that was it was included in the possibility space. I think that is something that people don't talk a lot about with game design, is by having content that is hypothetically reachable, but you almost certainly won't see it. Do you think that imbues more ordinary experiences with a sort of specialness?
Yes, and here's where this ties on to actually some of my post-Galaxies career, because after Galaxies, I wrote a book called A Theory of Fun for Game Design. It was about the fact that fun seems to be intrinsically tied to learning. I was reading a lot of psychology texts at the time and that kind of thing, but a big part of the impetus was people had critiqued Galaxies, saying, you know what, the moment-to-moment of this isn't that fun. It's overall compelling, but I don't necessarily feel like I'm having fun all the time. And I wanted to dig into that because it felt like in building these giant projects, I'd lost sight of just learning how to make a fun minigame, if you know what I mean. And so I started going and making minigames. I would make one a weekend and then bring it into the office on Monday mornings. I'll cut to the chase. Basically, dopamine is not a reward per se. It is also the motivator of curiosity. So it's part of our brain system for getting us to learn, to be inquisitive. And one thing that the human brain is excellent at, for survival reasons, is taking the unfamiliar and mastering it, not necessarily to actual mastery level, but just kind of a good enough level, and saying, I get that now. That's important so that we can function day to day. We don't think about the process of putting on our pants. We don't think about the process of walking anymore. We spent serious effort on learning how to walk, and then we just kind of take it for granted. And in fact, if you focus moment to moment on the act of walking, you probably will fall down, right? Because it's still very challenging. So it's important that we do it in an automatic way. We live our lives on automatic autopilot for most things that we do. And it's necessary for survival to do that. Well, when we think about what that means for games, I'm going to paraphrase what you said and summarize it as, when Jedi was out there in the world floating, but people didn't know how to get there, it meant that it was beyond the horizon of what you could see. In a game where you can see the horizon from where you're standing, it all becomes familiar even if you haven't walked over there. And then you pattern match it all. And you say, oh, well, from here to there is going to be more of the same, so I don't need to bother going. If the game can persuade you, no, there's something cool around the corner. No, there's a really cool thing beyond the ridge. You just can't see it yet. You're going to have to go there to actually have the new experience. That's one thing. You might keep going. But if you encounter a cool thing hidden behind a ridge every 100 yards, you'll just start going, well, every 100 yards there's going to be another, I get it. It's a classic problem in psychology. So, for example, regular reward schedules versus random reward schedules. We know that random ones are more compelling because you can't see the horizon on it. Whereas a regular reward is easy to extrapolate. And it's just a linear extrapolation. You just go, it's just going to be ding, 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 I get it, I'm out. Because it no longer provokes the mental rewards, the dopamine drops. There's nothing to be curious about. Jedi hanging out there left this open curiosity. It left this open problem out there on the horizon. And it made the problem set feel bigger. The landscape of the game was large. The size of a game is a tricky thing to think about. But I'm going to make a contention that Tetris is a deeper hole than a giant game like Last of Us or Assassin's Creed. Because Last of Us or Assassin's Creed is fundamentally structured as a series of rewards on a line. You know, Assassin's Creed lets you run around more loosely, but you're still checking off largely similar items. What keeps you going in that case is the story, is the curiosity about the story. Tetris, though, has this incredibly distant horizon for people, even though it's only got, a handful of pieces and hardly any moves or rules. Go has 2 colors of beads and a grid, and it is a bottomless pit that you cannot see the bottom of, right? And so very simple things can have huge horizons very far away. They can encompass huge areas for curiosity, and you can fall into them for a very long time. And something very elaborate and complex can actually be pretty small, even though it costs a fortune to make, even though it might have a super deep story and so on. The gameplay of it might not actually have much of a horizon at all. This is, of course, essentially ancient wisdom about journey versus destination. So all of this is stuff that we know in philosophy and cultural history and so on. But it manifests very directly in our games. When you play tic-tac-toe, as a kid, it feels like a bottomless pit. And then one day, you see the pattern and you never play it again. Except with a kid, right? To help them in their turn say, this is not worth playing, right? Like, that is the destination of most games, is to get figured out and thrown away. So if you're building an alternate world for people to exist in, the question of is it a journey or is it an end game destination is very pointed, particularly if your business model depends on it.
The Jedi Problem was only one of many factors that contributed to Star Wars Galaxies' eventual demise. Its ambitious scope, impossible deadlines, the controversial NGE update, the arrival of competitors like World of Warcraft, and countless other elements all conspired to bring about its death by 1,000 cuts. But despite it all, Galaxies still represents a deeply important chapter in games history. To this day, robust fan communities still run active servers that carry on the torch of Raph streams for Star Wars Galaxies. And as easy as it would be to write this off as just Star Wars fans being Star Wars fans, the game truly is special, and I say this as someone who was there on release playing it. At least half of the joy of this game was imagining the possibilities of Star Wars Galaxies. The summer it came out, me and my friend would spend our nights playing, and our days wandering the woods talking about things that we could do when we played later, exploring a new corner of Tatooine, opening a combination droid/pet shop, becoming entertainers in the local cantina, or fighting the Empire. And though we were never overtly driving toward Jedi status, the idea that we may someday stumble into this rarefied possibility on our travels lent a real specialness to all of these other activities. But the focus was always on the magic of a more ordinary type of Star Wars experience. This wasn't a game about being Luke Skywalker, it was a game about becoming one of the countless memorable side characters from the Star Wars universe. And this, to me, is the brilliance of Galaxies, and of so much of Raph Koster's work in general. It flies in the face of the reductive take that video games are inherently about power fantasy, and instead, it proposes a more radical vision for what games can do, a vision that the ultimate fantasy isn't being the chosen one. It is the freedom of expression through choice, through the act of play on one's own terms. The freedom to be a small but meaningful part of a larger, living, breathing world.